Sajid, thank you for joining Spectator TV.
Thank you.
To start, we've had 13 years of Tory rule. How is the NHS doing now?
Well, the NHS is getting record amounts of funding. It's dealing with more people and more patients than ever before in its history. It's got more doctors and nurses than ever before. It's had to deal with a pandemic which we haven't seen the likes of for decades. And so in many senses, it's doing well in terms of looking after so many people. But when you compare the NHS to other universal healthcare systems in countries we often compare ourselves to, our neighbours in Europe, Australia, Japan and other places, the health outcomes, which ultimately I think is what matters most to people, are definitely not as good as they should be.
You've become very vocal recently about calling for change and calling for reform of the NHS. What has propelled you to do that?
Well, after having been health secretary and as well as having obviously other jobs in government, which I was dealing with the Department of Health and Social Care, it's become more of a challenge, I think, because of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, I think we could see, because of an aging society, because of the changes in the burden of disease, especially since the NHS was created, because of the expectations that people rightly have for the latest drugs and treatments. So we've seen this surge in demand, and supply hasn't been keeping up. And I think when we all sort of look at it and we do an honest assessment, the fact that so many people are waiting for GPs, they're waiting for A&E, they're waiting for ambulances, they're waiting for scans and operations, that's not, it's far from ideal. And I think we have to then look at that and think to ourselves, when funding is at such a record high, that what are the causes of this? How come other countries aren't facing necessarily the same issues in delivery when they all have the same challenges of rising demand? And I think we have to, as politicians, be honest in our assessment, and instead of what I think sometimes is a sort of politicians are sort of leaning into adulation, competing with each other, is to say, look, where the NHS works well, great, but if it doesn't work well, if it's not delivering what British people would rightly expect, we should be honest and have an assessment and have a serious debate about its future and what's the best way to make it fit for the future.
I remember when you became health secretary, you made a point of not wearing that NHS badge that many health secretaries before did. And I seem to recall that the suggestion was, I don't want to be glorifying the system. I want to see what works and what doesn't for doctors and nurses and patients and the rest.
Yep.
But you are by no means as vocal as you are now about the necessary reform that you think needs to take place. What is going so wrong in the political discussion that it takes an MP who was leading the health service, but has now announced that they're going to be stepping down and not running for re-election, that only at that point do politicians tend to feel comfortable to start talking about this stuff?
Well, I think you're right, it is about politicians. It's not one particular party. I think all the major political parties have been, really, when it comes to the NHS, just sort of focusing on almost treating it like a religion, like the rest of the country, as though it's above criticism. And at the end of the day, we must remember it's a health service, and it's there really obviously for all of us. But what we want out of it are the best outcomes. And I think where politicians get stuck really is that they are very afraid to speak honestly and openly about the challenges of the NHS and how to fix them, because frankly they just don't want to get their heads shot off. They just feel that they think that's not what the public want to hear. But interestingly, I've started talking about the NHS a lot recently, as you say, about the future of it, because I'm deeply concerned about it. Just the last couple of days I wrote about it in the Times and elsewhere, and I can tell you just today I've had so many emails from people, from the public, coming into me unsolicited about my comments, the vast majority in support of what I'm saying, which is let's have an honest debate, let's have a royal commission. But interestingly, when I was looking at them earlier today, so vast majority in support, but most of those that are in support from people working inside the NHS, doctors, nurses, consultants from inside the NHS, talking about this and saying, it's great that you, Sajid, Tony Blair today, and others are openly talking about the kind of things that need to change.
Another politician talking about change is Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. Does it worry you as a Tory MP that Labour might be bolder on this topic and might be offering up more solutions come the next general election than your own party?
No, not really. Look, I want to see an NHS that's fit for the future. And I think to get there, we are going to need politicians on all sides to work together. One of the things that we've had in this country for many, many years is a sort of settlement, let's say, on the NHS, a political settlement. And by and large, for many years, that's served the country well, up until more recently, where these challenges that we now face, that sort of settlement almost is stopping an honest debate. But going forward, if we don't want the NHS to be used as a day-to-day political football, I think getting all politicians to agree that there are some serious problems, that it does require an honest assessment, and there are an agreeing way forward. Now, I think the way forward is a Royal Commission. I read the other day that West Streeting is saying it's not a Royal Commission, but I think that actually getting all politicians to agree to a way forward to an honest assessment with experts as well as politicians involved, and then when this Royal Commission reports back, having the government of the day make the decisions as it should in a proper democratic fashion is the right way forward.
I want to ask you a little bit about money because, again, you were Health Secretary. You will have had detailed understanding about how much money is really funneled into the health service. I think it's now approaching about 44% of public service day-to-day spending. I think there's this almost universal assumption that one of the struggles for the NHS is that it was so badly underfunded by Tory governments during the years of austerity. But if you look back and you look at government-only spending, the NHS consistently ranks in the top 4 countries in the OECD's rankings for government-only spending. Do you think that money is the problem? Do you think the system is the problem? One thing I'm curious about is whether or not the system is actually stopping more money from going in. Because if we look at these other universal systems, they're much more pragmatic about combining state and private sector money to top up their health service.
Yeah, the NHS, as we know, relies almost entirely on taxpayer funding, unlike, as you rightly pointed out, many other, well, actually all other universal healthcare systems. So when we talk about countries like Germany and France and Italy and Japan and Australia, right, all of them, right? Now, all those countries, by the way, by having a universal healthcare system, unlike, let's say, the United States, which is a system I would not want to see anything like that here in the UK. If you compare ourselves to other European countries, as you say, they have funding from multiple sources. Now, the lion's share is probably still coming from the state one way or the other, but people are able to contribute, and in almost all those countries, they contribute in a means-tested way. So the end result of that is that as a value I think we can all sign up to, which is that anyone in a country, no matter who they are, should get world-class healthcare, but based on their needs, based on their on their means and their ability, right? So your means should not hold you back from getting the care that you need. And so that's how these countries have approached it. What happens in the UK, and I haven't seen this just from the perspective as a health secretary, but as chancellor as well, is that when any chancellor, when they're allocating funding, of course there's many other trade-offs to be made. You need to, what about education? What about, especially now, defence costs are going up, interest rates are going up. All of those need government funding as well. So inevitably there's trade-offs, and a chancellor will look at the biggest budget in government, the NHS, and inevitably the NHS will have to be a consequence of that trade-off. So to avoid that to some extent, I think having a look at other models of care and how they're funded is the right thing to do. But also is to, when you look at the overall funding, is to realise that it's not a question of funding, in that other countries with less funding seem to be getting better outcomes. So you have to look at the model, and you have to look at many other aspects of healthcare.
I think it's very interesting that you've had so many people writing to you since your comments in the Times, saying that they, broadly speaking, agree with you. How do you process getting these messages from patients who are having a tough time with the sights that we saw this week at Westminster Abbey, with politicians praying over the NHS, doing readings, essentially giving sermons? I mean, in my mind, it really doesn't add up.
Well, look, I think there is, when you look at the NHS, especially over the 75-year history, I think if we're talking about the people that work in the NHS, the doctors, the nurses, consultants, and anyone who's working in the NHS in any capacity, I think these people are, in my experience, they are people that work incredibly hard, they're incredibly dedicated, they're compassionate, caring people, but they are working within the structures that have been created for them ultimately by politicians of many parties, successive governments, and that broad structure of the NHS hasn't changed when the world around it has changed dramatically. And so the people in the NHS, I think they do deserve thanks for doing what they do, but I think if we are to properly support them, we must realise the challenges that they work in can be alleviated to a huge extent if we, as politicians, take a dispassionate look at the NHS and its structures.
Last question. You became Health Secretary well into 2021 as we were looking to lift restrictions and go back to normal life. I know you weren't there at the height of lockdown.
Yeah.
A lot of what we're seeing now, especially with these record waiting lists, is a result of people staying at home and treatments vastly delayed. Do you think in retrospect that stay-at-home messaging to protect the NHS was a mistake?
I don't know in terms of the nature of your question, because I don't think we have enough data yet. In the NHS has, compared to other countries, has less capacity when you look at it in terms of beds versus, say, Germany has something like 7 beds per 1,000 when we have 2 or 3. When you look at it in terms of scanning equipment and number of doctors and nurses, it has less capacity than most other European countries.
And intentionally run that way to stay
and it's been run that, it's the NHS is run at about 95% capacity, when in most other countries in Europe they run around 80-85% capacity. So when it was already running at a very high sort of rate before the pandemic hit, I think, obviously I wasn't there at the time, but I can understand reasons as to why the decisions that were made were made. I think I don't want to, even though I've been there as Health Secretary during half of the pandemic, let's say, I don't want to really second guess the decisions that were made at the time, because I don't feel I have all the information.
Sajid, thanks for joining Spectator TV.
Good, thank you very much.